Radio, the way it should be heard.
The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests and not necessarily those of TalkTainmentRadio.com, 3MR Production, its ownership, management, or staff.
So where's the power?
The power is right here on TalkTainmentRadio.com. Radio, the way it should be heard.
Where is the power?
This is Fight Back with Dr. Bob Fitrakis, heard exclusively on the world's greatest radio, TalkTainmentRadio.com. Radio, the way it should be heard. I'm Bob Fitrakis. Fight back. Fight back. TalkTainmentRadio.com, the world's greatest radio. You're in touch with Dr. Bob Fitrakis. You're listening to Fight Back. And this is radio, the way it should be heard. Tonight, we're privileged to have Don DeBar, a journalist from New York who specializes in Libya. And I had the privilege on going with a delegation to Libya, led by former U.S. Rep. Cynthia McKinney. And Don has been in touch with the situation there. And we're going to see if we can deconstruct what the mainstream American media has been telling you and see if we're not really looking at a new Bay of Pigs. Don, welcome to Fight Back.
Thanks, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing well. And again, once again, the American media seems to be missing some of the points. My favorite thing, I was watching Ambassador Rice the other day, and she said America only led this for 2 days, and then it was taken over by NATO. And I couldn't help but think during the height of the Cold War, if we heard the Soviets only went into Afghanistan for 2 days, and then it was taken over by the Warsaw Pact.
Yeah, that Poland is a tough army.
So,
yeah, I guess we'd start with last Friday. NBC started last Friday with the claim that the Gaddafi family, including Muammar Gaddafi, had left Tripoli, that they were in Tunisia, that they bailed, and that got picked up by everybody else, and that was the narrative from Friday afternoon until sometime Sunday, when all of a sudden the Gaddafi was back in Tripoli, and supposedly Tripoli was 80% occupied, and 3 of Gaddafi's sons were in custody, quote unquote. I mean, I'm starting there arbitrarily. That's just the beginning of the narrative this week, but there's been a fantastic aspect to the coverage of this, even from before the beginning. In February, for example, the Pakistan Observer reported on February 25th that there was a landing of U.S., U.K., and French troops and equipment in Benghazi on Indian troop transport vessels.
Come on, Don, that can't be true. This is an indigenous uprising, and the U.S. and NATO aren't involved.
Yeah, let me start there, because you mentioned we were in Tripoli, and it was in October of 2009, before this mess started, and we had an opportunity to go out into the city and bounce around and meet people and see how people lived and all of that. So when I started to hear that there was an indigenous uprising taking place in Libya, I was kind of shocked, because while we were there, I learned some things about Libya. Number one, just looking at it, Tripoli was a nice city. There were blocks of housing, apartment buildings, and smaller scale, urban, like 2-3-story buildings. Construction cranes all over the place. In the old city, when we were walking around, it looked like from the outside, very, very old. I mean, maybe 500 to 1,000-year-old buildings, like in a lot of European cities. Looks like crumbly stuff built into the mountain till you get close, and you see there's like a solid oak door with shiny brass fixtures on it, and the door, some of the apartments or the houses had the doors open, and you see polished tile and oak and mahogany and stuff inside, big screen TVs and everything. And started to realize, wow, these people live pretty well here, and found out that everyone owns their home. That's considered a human right there, and without mortgages, rent, real estate taxes, any of that. You are a Libyan, you own your home, and I just described the quality of them, and found also that the education system through the postgraduate level was free, meaning no $200,000 student loans to pay off when you get out, available to everyone, universal health care. And I learned later, looking at video of what Representative McKinney had the people with her on the last trip shot when they were documenting the civilian casualties of the NATO bombing by visiting and interviewing people in the hospitals, that the hospitals are comparable to the hospitals here, like the suburban hospitals and regional hospitals, 21st century hospitals, free health care, both in the case of education and health care. What you need isn't available locally, for example, if you need a particular procedure and just prefer to have it done, say, at Johns Hopkins or some specialized hospital, Sloan Kettering or whatever, they pay for you to go there. They pay for you and your family to be put up in the area. They pay for the treatment. And this is not for the elite or the management class, which doesn't really exist, but rather every Libyan. This is a human right that they have. And in addition to that, there's a monthly distribution of the oil revenues to the population in the amount between $2,500, $3,500 a month per household. So when your housing is covered, your health care is covered, and your education is covered, and now you're getting a check. This is before you set foot out the door to go to work. I found a real disconnect between that material condition, which I witnessed, and the idea that people were in the streets demanding change, particularly given what's going on in this country right now.
And as part of that narrative, we never really got from the Big Six, the corporate Big Six media here, that Gaddafi also passed out a million guns
That's right.
to his
Just
population. What sort of dictator arms his people if they hate him?
It's exactly right. That's a huge disconnect, and that's the reason that it wasn't reported here. But that part was reported fairly widely outside the United States. The fact that he was handing out the weapons wasn't quite phrased the way that he's arming the people, but in fact, that's what they were doing. And those guns, apparently are just beginning to be fired over the last few days because this expeditionary force, came into Tripoli. But before I get into that, just a little more context. Going back to February, in addition to the idea that, first of all, there was this indigenous and completely home self-sufficient rebellion going on against the horrible objective conditions that I just described. There was also
there were a big government oppressing people, Don.
Yeah, that's right.
Take
right.
this house.
No mortgage swindles. You can't do any of the things that entertain people here.
Go to school for free.
But in addition to the narrative began with this indigenous rebellion, and then there was the next peg in that narrative was that Gaddafi and the Libyan military were brutally repressing the demonstrations, they were called at that time, including with aerial firepower. And this is, the enabling narrative that led to the UN resolutions 1970 and 1973. But unfortunately for, basically a fact test of the narrative, the specific dates, times, and places that were presented to the UN Security Council and to the media were addressed by the Russian government. The Russian government, I would remind people, has satellite surveillance of planet Earth because they anticipated for a good 40, 50 years a nuclear strike from the United States or from Europe or from any of the hundreds of bases and or possible submarine locations that surrounded the Soviet Union. And they said, here's the aerial photography of that place on that date at that time. There's no planes. Here's the aerial photography from that place, that date, that time, no planes. And they showed that, in fact, that there was no truth whatsoever to that claim. And yet we end up with the resolutions, 1970, which was a sanctions resolution, and 1973, which was a no-fly zone resolution. And then somehow, from there, straight through the War Powers Act and Constitution not being applicable because at that point 90 days worth of bombing of Tripoli and other locations didn't constitute hostilities, and so it didn't fall within the War Powers Act. We end up to a point where a couple of weeks ago we see the head of the so-called rebel army being killed by so-called rebels, and a coincident with the U.S. and its allies being about to hand over $1.5 billion of Libyan sovereign funds that were taken out of the bank and going to be handed over to these people. The guy who was the former justice minister in the Gaddafi government, who is now going to be the payee, fires the head of the communications infrastructure, the propaganda apparatus, the Minister of Information, fires the finance minister, which means, the checks will be made out to me, and it cleans house, basically. This group is a hierarchy, it seems, because one guy fired everybody else. And at that point, it begins to look like a coup d'etat with Western backing rather than not only whether or not it's an indigenous uprising, but an uprising at all.
Yeah, interesting, though. My understanding, the Soviets did have photos showing Arab civilians being killed from the air. It was a country called the United States in 2003 and during the first Gulf War. You may remember the St. Petersburg Times, not the real St. Petersburg in Russia, but the Florida newspaper had satellite photos bought by commercially from the Soviets showing that the army of Saddam was not massed on the border of Saudi Arabia about to attack. So once again, the objective evidence shows that the reality of the war is a lie, and that perhaps someone like John Perkins, who says, look, this is how you got to look at this. Libya under Gaddafi has 140 tons of gold in their central bank, and they've been talking to South Africa about an African currency, which would be actually based in real precious metals, and that the United States simply is not going to allow that. They've also got other assets, well over 1,000 miles of beautiful, undeveloped, clean Mediterranean beachfront.
That's right. It's beautiful. Look, if you just looked at this as a real estate hustle, okay, it's an obvious one. You have, like you said, 1,000 miles of. We stayed in a hotel that backed up to a nice piece of the Mediterranean coast. Nothing between the hotel and the beach or and the water, but a tennis court that was being used for something else. I don't remember what, and beach. That was it. And there were hotels being constructed by the Koreans and I forget who else, the Japanese, I think, and also what looked like luxury apartment buildings being constructed along that beachfront all around us. It looked like Houston in the 1980s in the area that we were staying in Tripoli. And the narrative about the situation on the ground in Libya, it's been interesting the last couple of weeks for me. I've been doing a lot of media interviews with foreign press, and particularly on Press TV, they've had like guy from Libyan emigre living in London, and guy who is based in Damascus or somewhere else, talking about the conditions on the ground in Libya, and describing a situation where, and some Libyan emigres here, describing a situation where Gaddafi has been stealing the money since 1969, hasn't invested a dime in Libya, that the place is crumbly, people have nothing, and that this is the basis of their discontent, aside from him being a tyrant, dictator, or whatever. And all of that...
And they were last there in 1969.
Yeah, right, exactly. When Libya was the poorest country in the world by every objective measure, and the report that was being issued by the United Nations, or was issued by the United Nations in December of last year, January, showing that it is actually the standard of living there is the highest on the continent of Africa, one of the highest, first or second highest in the so-called Middle East, in the Muslim world, which is, North Africa, so-called Middle East, and Southwest Asia, that in many areas it's comparable to so-called first world countries. And, I just described some areas where here in the United States, a poll came out 2 weeks ago that 64% of the population does not have $1,000 of assets. If there were an emergency, they don't have $1,000 cash. There, if they don't have $1,000 cash, they wait for the monthly check to come in on the oil revenues, and they don't have to pay rent, so it's not going to that. They don't have a student loan, so it's not going to that. They don't have to pay for health care, so it's not going to that. And the food there, which I saw you partake some, I sure did myself.
I won't deny it. It was incredible.
It was great, and it was cheap. It was, you would spend twice as much, hopping from hot dog stand to hot dog stand in Manhattan as it would cost for a decent meal in a restaurant.
I was
there.
oppressed. Gaddafi oppressed me with fresh figs and seafood.
That's right. It was amazing. And so, the entire operation from the beginning was obviously untrue to anyone familiar with the facts. The problem, with that is that in the United States, they've been demonizing Libya and Gaddafi, I would say at least since 1986, when Reagan bombed, the same place that NATO's been pounding the hell out of for the last 6 months.
Now, how does that protect civilian? I've always tried to get to this aspect of the narrative, is we're going in there to protect Arab civilians in Benghazi, and then they bomb his compound 86 times was the last figure I saw. How does bombing the sovereign head of Libya's compound save civilians in Benghazi who there was no evidence were being bombed anyway?
Right. There were civilians in Benghazi who were being, murdered and tortured and such, but they were the African-looking, the black Libyans who were tagged by NATO and the United States public relations machine as being mercenaries from sub-Saharan Africa, and there were lynchings, proud lynchings. One murder that was carried by Al Jazeera, where the rebel troops, quote unquote, called the guy's family and said, we're going to kill him. Watch Al Jazeera, and they did proudly, and Al Jazeera carried it proudly. Those in a variety of cities. The black Libyans, and by the way, folks, Libya is in Africa. They got some black folks there that are actually Libyans, not from Cameroon, although there are people from Cameroon there, not from South Africa, although there are people from South Africa there, but actual black Libyans. And as a matter of fact, in Tripoli, somewhere between a third and a half the population. But what was happening was that crowds of people, not even crowds, but groups of these rebels were grabbing, lynching, torturing, and videotaping while they did it, black Libyans, and accusing them of being either mercenaries or sympathizers with the mercenaries.
Okay, hold that thought. TalkTainmentRadio.com, the world's greatest radio, the home of Dr. Bob Fitrakis. That's me speaking. Stay right there. more revelations about the situation in Libya with reporter Don DeBar, who went to Libya in October of 2009. Is it really an indigenous uprising, or is it a U.S.-backed coup d'etat? Coming up next.
So where's the power?
The power is right here on TalkTainmentRadio.com. Radio, the way it should be heard.
Where is the power?
Have you been brutally assaulted or attacked? Are you a victim of a violent and heinous crime such as rape, assault, homicide, vicious dog bite, domestic violence, or an intoxicated driver offense? You have rights and can be compensated up to $50,000 for medical and or psychological expenses, reimbursement of lost wages, loss of support for dependents, funeral and burial expenses, and much more. MCVAP is available to federal crime victims. Contact the Columbus Urban League Minority Community Victims Assistance Program, 257-6300.
So where's the power?
The power is right here on TalkTainmentRadio.com. Radio, the way it should be heard.
Where is the power? Get up, stand up.
TalkTainmentRadio.com, the world's greatest radio. This is Dr. Bob Fitrakis. You're listening to Fight Back. If you want to join in the conversation with Don DeBar, a journalist from New York who's been to Libya and following the situation, call 1-877-932-9766. That's 1-877-932-9766. Don, you were suggesting that the problems at the beginning of this so-called indigenous uprising may have reflected racism towards black Africans.
Actually, I do say that the racism was stoked by the public relations efforts of the U.S. Backed group, and it was used as a weapon to intimidate and frighten people in the same way that the bombing for the past 6 months and 5 days, or 5 months and 5 days, of Libya has been a terror campaign. Just to give people a flavor of the psychological impact of the bombing on the population, which is one of the major intended purposes of it. There was a day that Cynthia McKinney was in Tripoli while bombing was going on, and she was holed up with some people from the African Union who were there on a fact-finding mission. And I believe the day was like the middle of June. And there was a 12-and-a-half-hour bombing campaign conducted against Tripoli. They counted 89 bombs dropped in one day. Now, the United States has been at war with certainly Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, a number of other places, just in that region alone. It'll be 10 years coming up in October, or however quickly after September 11th they launched out. This was over the explosion of two jetliners into two buildings in Manhattan, and a jetliner supposedly into the Pentagon. The TNT tonnage, or the impact of the airplanes vis-a-vis 89 explosions in the middle of a city that is about the size of Manhattan, there's about the size of New York City, that has a population about the size of Manhattan. You have to consider that just in the one day out of 89 bombs, probably the terror aspect was eclipsed in the first 15 minutes. After the first 3 or 4 explosions, the other 86 that day were just gravy in terms of the terror impact. And then if you fit that one day into about 140 days of bombing, you can understand the scale, and then weigh that against the fact that this takes place in a sea where on the one hand you have 300 million people here, and on the other hand you had 6 million people. That's been reduced to 4.5 or 5, with the people that have left, the migrant workers and such that went running, primarily sub-Saharan Africans because they saw people that looked like them being lynched, shot, tortured, and killed publicly.
It's an interesting analysis. If we think about it, the U.S. essentially shocking and awing Libya. But at the same time, I was always struck by the fact that there was this intervention in Libya by the United States, which tries to hide it, saying, it's really NATO. But at the same time, civilians are being killed in Somalia.
Yep.
An Islamic fundamentalist group, forced starvation, 50,000 dead children, and the United States stood by and watched while those Somalian innocent victims died.
Mm-hmm. Sure, and like Rwanda before it, and let's go back even to Germany. The heartstrings of people concerned over those kinds of things, which is I would say, a portion of the population of the United States, and they tend to be, let's say, left of center, that would be interested in a genuine humanitarian intervention. Their heartstrings were pulled by the allegations that this was a humanitarian intervention because there was going to be this bloodbath, and we stood by. I heard this enough times from so-called progressives on, say, Democracy Now! And the Free Speech Radio News and other places that, I had believed for a good long time were progressive radio outlets and media outlets, saying that there's going to be 350,000 deaths, and we didn't do anything in Rwanda, and we didn't do anything here or there, and we must do something now. And yet, I'm not hearing any of those people call for intervention in Bahrain, for example, or in Somalia or anything else. And honestly, I'm glad because of this. The intervention would be conducted by the U.S. military. Until the people of the United States have control of the U.S. government and thereby, theoretically anyway, control of the U.S. military, someone else does. And the people who have control of the U.S. military use it to pursue their own specific private interests, which are generally in opposition to the large masses of people. And so any intervention by the U.S. military under those conditions is going to be an intervention in opposition to the interests of the people and on behalf of those who are interested in exploiting them and not afraid of killing a few or many in the process. So the cries stopped over Libya. They haven't been carried forth to the situation in Bahrain where you had the Saudis and the Qataris just go in and put down what was, in fact, a genuine popular uprising in a country that is occupied by, this huge U.S. naval installation. And, again, the left press that was making this argument before hasn't really said very much at all.
Well, to me, it's a question of the new Barbary pirates. The pirates now are the United States and NATO. This is really about plundering a very wealthy country, taking advantage of the so-called Arab Spring to go in there and take out a sovereign head of state with huge assets in gold and other resources and oil, and justifying it by claiming it's for democracy and a humanitarian aid. It seemed real obvious to me that the rebels would not get to Tripoli without the air cover provided by NATO and the weapons provided by NATO.
That's correct. In terms of the argument that it's for democracy, for example, aside from the fact that having the U.S. military intervene on behalf of revolutionaries seeking democracy, that would be an historic novelty, first of all. But in terms of, the players on the ground, we only need to look at the events of 2 or 3 weeks ago for their first exercise in democracy. Mustafa Jalil exercised democracy in terms of shaking up the cabinet there by, I won't say he killed the general who was running his army, but his forces certainly did. And in addition to that, the entire composition of that changed on his diktat. He now is the payee for the billions of revenues that are going into that entity, the NTC. He manages the information flow. He's doing a fine job of that, by the way. He can't keep track of which Gaddafis he's got in custody and all of that. And I guess he assumes that the American people and others, but it's the American public they're trying to sell to primarily, that the American people can't even remember from 10 minutes ago what was being said. The attention span of the public is admittedly short here, but when he says in the morning that we have 3 Gaddafi sons in custody and one of them is in the process of being transshipped off to Brussels, and then that one shows up in the back of his SUV riding around Tripoli that's supposedly 85 to 95% occupied by the rebels, and another one, all by his lonesome, somehow manages to escape from a group of armed, people that are so rough and tough that they're taking over the country from the military. The information coming out of his information ministry is nonsense, and the money aspect of it, we can wait and see, but believe me, Jalil is not going to be distributing $2,500 checks to the households in Libya, because if that was his intent, he could have just left everything alone and let the checks come in and cash his every month.
What about the reports that American financial interests or banks may have already profited from the crisis?
They profit from everything. The things don't happen. What is it? Even if a bird should fall to the ground, I know about it. They are exactly like that. I won't say that they make policy in the United States, but the solution, policy solution to the Great Recession, was to take all the money that the government could print and lay its hands on and hand it to those people, and without them requiring them to invest a dime of it in the economy to spark it, and without any restrictions on them paying themselves individually, converting those funds to their private benefit. So, not that they determine policy in Washington, but they sure are lucky.
So what's happening right now? When we're looking at the situation right now, right before I came on the air, they kept repeating there was no central authority in Tripoli, and perhaps the rebels may be a little too exuberant in shooting their weapons everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's true. First, there's one point that needs to be, one piece of data that needs to be disseminated as widely as possible, because the media is not carrying it. First I'll source it. There's a a journalist from the UK named Lizzie Phelan, who also has worked under the name of Lizzie Cocker, and she has been to Libya a number of times over the years, but this year, since this situation heated up, she was there at least 3 times that I know of, each time for a period of a month or several weeks. Now, I first got to know her when Cynthia McKinney was on the ground in Tripoli in May and June, I think it was, and she had been filing reports, and I tracked her down, and we would discuss matters back and forth, and she would help source some things for me from the ground in Tripoli, and that I would spread around out here. And I was able to get hold of her. I was up all night Sunday night. Sunday's the day that supposedly the rebels, who had been being routed only a week and a half prior on almost every front, they were talking about them having to, take refuge in Benghazi. Suddenly they were in control of 85% of the city or something, and so I went looking for her, and I found her, and we were able to communicate by text back and forth for a good half hour, 45 minutes, and I got a decent amount of data from her. And among that information was the following. First, unlike the journalists, quote-unquote, from CNN, the Matthew Chance, for example, and others, who have been reporting on the conditions around the city while simultaneously being held captive. Quote unquote, inside the hotel.
Hi, we're locked up, but let us tell you what's going on.
This was the entire, Western press corps was, being basically stuck in a hotel, in the Rixos Hotel for, that whole period somehow, and they're witnessing the fact that the area around them is controlled by the government forces, so the only real estate they can actually see, the government is in control of, but yet somehow, without having any outside contact, they are aware of the fact that the rebels are in control of the remainder of the city. I don't know exactly how they came to that conclusion, but that is what they were reporting, and that's what was carried here, without question. Anyway, the information that I got from Lizzie, who, having been there over the years and having been there, for a month or so, 3 different times this year already, had connections, contacts all over the city. She got on the phone and started calling, in your neighborhood, what's going on there, and in the south end of here, what's going on there, and what's going on near Green Square, across the street from where you live, and et cetera. And what she was finding out was, number one, some of these places had seen no rebels whatsoever or anybody else. It was just, what are you talking about? Life as usual. There's some bombs going off somewhere. I hope none land here, but that's the extent of it. And in others, that the government was in control, that there were people that came in and there were, firefights back and forth, and that the invading troops were not Libyans. They had the beards and, characteristics of Qataris. They were operating as military units, not ragtag, teenagers shooting guns in the air like you've seen in YouTube ad nauseum, but actual military units, but dressed up as revolutionaries, and yet being managed by their officer corps, who were dressed in Qatari military uniforms. And in addition to that, she was told from several of these places and reported to me that there were lots of dead Qataris on the ground, on the streets in Tripoli. So, what had happened was, meanwhile, in the harbor, that beautiful harbor that was behind our hotel, there was a large troop transport ship that was the source of the of these Qatari soldiers. So there were, in addition to that,
which may explain the sudden turnaround by the rebels who are being routed a week or so ago.
Yes, exactly. What happened was NATO apparently, obviously, decided to get directly involved, and so I don't know what the financial arrangements were, so I won't say that the Qataris were mercenaries. I might say that about Al Jazeera, the way it's reported on behalf of the interests of the Qatari royal family, who I assume has a similar interest to the troops that they fielded. But the situation was essentially that the rebels were supported with a ground invasion consisting at that point of Qatari troops. They, as Gaddafi had said, and as anyone who understands, guerrilla warfare knows, basically they were led into the town that they don't know. It's not a jungle; it's a desert. So, while you're out, you fight outside, everybody can see everybody, and their side has the U.S. air cover and reconnaissance flights, and the government doesn't have anything in the air, so come into the city and let's fight here. And that's apparently what happened. Also, the soil that this takes place in, which hasn't really been had an opportunity to be tested to the hilt yet, but it's a population that's armed.
All right, hold that thought. We'll be right back. TalkTainmentRadio.com, the world's greatest radio and the home of Dr. Bob Fitrakis. Stay right there. Find out the real story of what's going on in Libya with reporter Don DeBar. What about the Qatari influence, impact? Coming up next.
So where's the power? The power is right here on TalkTainmentRadio.com. Radio, the way it should be heard.
Have you been brutally assaulted or attacked? Are you a victim of a violent and heinous crime such as rape, assault, homicide, vicious dog bite, domestic violence, or an intoxicated driver offense? You have rights and can be compensated up to $50,000 for medical and or psychological expenses, reimbursement of lost wages, loss of support for dependents, funeral and burial expenses, and much more. MCVAP is available to federal crime victims. Contact the Columbus Urban League Minority Community Victims Assistant Program, 257-6300.
So where's the power? The power is right here on TalkTainmentRadio.com. Radio, the way it should be heard.
TalkTainmentRadio.com, the world's greatest radio. This is Dr. Bob Fitrakis. You're listening to Fight Back, and journalist Don DeBar, who's been to Libya. I was on that trip in October 2009. We're talking about the current situation in Libya. Why would a brutal dictator release 1 million guns to his people? If you want to join in the conversation, it's 1-877-932-9766. That's 1-877-932-9766. So you're saying, Don, that you believe foreign troops, Qatari troops, obviously backed by NATO, are attempting to topple the government of Libya.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, there's further evidence of their intent to expand that presence, the direct presence. On CNN this afternoon and this evening, they're starting to soften the public up for ground invasion by, if not NATO directly, what they said were Middle Eastern allies, a joint...
Well, no doubt to save children and small furry puppies.
Well, yeah, this particular adventure is because all of a sudden there are, yes, can you say it, WMDs. There's supposedly an old depot
I heard
of
that
mustard
line.
gas.
Now we're worried about those falling into the hands of terrorists.
Right, and so they would send in Saudis, for example, which, if I'm
Well,
not
only
mistaken,
15 of 19 of the hijackers that attacked us on 9/11 were Saudis.
Right, exactly. And by the way, people may recall when this adventure started that Gaddafi made the accusation that among the rebels and an influential part of the fighting force, a substantial part of the fighting force, consisted of Al-Qaeda troops that had been fighting in, they had been gathered from various parts of the region to fight on the side of the resistance in Iraq, and they were called home, and they and Al-Qaeda fighters from other parts of the region also were called into Libya. It turns out they're part of the so-called rebel army to the extent one really exists, and they're a substantial part of it. So the very people that they will send to secure this mustard gas are the terrorists that they would have us believe they're trying to protect it from.
And there were numerous reports early on that Benghazi in the eastern part of the country had been a fertile ground for Al-Qaeda recruitment.
Well, it's a perfect, if you think in the geopolitical terms, you've had the overthrow of the Mubarak regime and a questionable security situation in Egypt, and by the way, there was video that I had gotten, I think prior to when Cynthia McKinney was over the last time in May or early June, that came from some of the people she knows knew on the ground in Tripoli, that sent me a video of Egyptians that were fighting with the rebels in Benghazi at the early onset of this. Not necessarily, I don't know, and it wasn't intimated to me whether they were there with the Egyptian government or not, but certainly both borders, the western and eastern border of Libya, we have Tunisia on the west and Egypt on the east. The situation is not secure, and so if you were going to have a place where you could have quote-unquote terrorist camps or whatever, or Al-Qaeda training, that would be the place to do it. And given the real history of Al-Qaeda, that's the term people use, I mean, it's been referred to as the CIA's Rolodex. Now, these are folks that no one questions this particular fact. They were originally assembled to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan by the United States directly, and trained and funded. So, the idea that the U.S. now has nothing to do with them and is somehow going to mitigate their impact or control flies in the face of the history of it and common sense, and also I think fails to understand the true relationship between the U.S. government and this group that they term Al-Qaeda.
Well, there was numerous reports that through the Kosovo Liberation Army that we encouraged Al-Qaeda to go to the former Yugoslavia and fight in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Sarajevo, in Kosovo, and that we looked the other way. We knew they were there. We knew they had already attacked the World Trade Center under Bill Clinton, and here we were encouraging them to come to the former Yugoslavia before NATO took action.
Absolutely right. That's absolutely right. We're talking in the mid '90s in terms of the former Yugoslavia and or the remnants of Yugoslavia, to be more accurate, because of that NATO found a way to do pilot bomber training in Europe at that particular moment in time, and it was the first bombing of Europe since 1945, if I'm not mistaken. And they had a massive bombing campaign there that worked in conjunction, certainly, with what Al-Qaeda was doing on the ground. So the idea that they're not, that they wouldn't be working together now in the, as a defense against all of the, the evidence that's apparent, I don't think it holds water. They have a history of doing it.
Does NATO have to go in? Will NATO go in? I mean, that's what it's looking towards.
I think, this is tea leaf reading, but it seems to me that the likelihood that NATO would directly go in there, it probably won't happen because of the political fallout that will take place in Europe. And the European populations are a bit less reticent about expressing their the displeasure with policy than people here in the United States who are, sitting in front of their TV sets and, whatever in the face of the economic devastation we're facing and such. They go in the streets. I mean, we can look at what's happened in London in the last few weeks. There's only one example of what's happened in Greece and in Spain, and what's developing even more so. And popular opinion in Europe is certainly not in favor of fighting a war or occupying Libya. So a direct NATO occupation, I think, would create further strain on the very fabric of NATO that might cause it to split apart. That said, certainly the only solution to a population that does not want to be occupied and will, in terms of balance of power, will not be occupied by an assemblage or an ad hoc assemblage of irregulars that, no matter how much money and air support the West gives them, the only solution to that is for them to directly occupy the country somehow. And so whether it's termed NATO or if it's termed the GCC or some other device, AFRICOM, 2 or something, whatever, their only way of holding the country really in the manner that they intend would be to occupy it. However, that's not the only potential model. I mean, you have to look at what are the geopolitical considerations for this in the first place? The oil obviously is an important one, but the occupation of Iraq, even though it's a direct occupation, has not been a calm one, certainly, and yet they are managing to, extract oil resources, and certainly are intending to do that at some point in the future, and that's been sufficient for them to continue on the crazy policy that they've conducted there. But there's larger issues with respect to Libya that you started to touch on before. I mean, let's start with Nelson Mandela and Gaddafi. This horrible dictator, by the way, is for some reason held in the highest esteem by a man who the same people that believe he's a dictator say is a saint, Nelson Mandela. Mandela credits Gaddafi personally and the Libyan people with playing the greatest role extrinsic to South Africa itself in ending apartheid. There was a little chess beating contest back and forth with Bill Clinton in the mid-'90s over a visit that Mandela wanted to take to Libya to visit Gaddafi and to thank him publicly for the assistance that the Libyans and Gaddafi had provided to the ANC and to the people of South Africa. And Bill Clinton and others here said, absolutely not, you can't go. And Mandela said, look, this guy helped us. You were on the other side, so shut up. I'm going anyway. And he did. In fact, if you go to my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Don DeBar, DONDEBAR, my Facebook profile picture is Nelson Mandela with his arms around Gaddafi. And that's a real photograph. It's not a Photoshop fix, folks. And so that's just at the very head end of it. The material things that have been happening is that Gaddafi's main project for decades now has been to try to develop what they call, he and other Pan-Africanists call, the United States of Africa. Not that they're going to set up a United States of America on African soil, but rather they're going to have a unitary or in any event coordinate, integrated, continent-wide economy that is not controlled from the outside, but from within Africa by the African people, including an African bank, a continental bank,
and a continental currency, right?
That's right, a continental currency.
That's actually based on precious metals that Africa has
in abundance, and the plans of and the historical expropriation of the materials, the plans for those materials, in the West are that they intend and have always intended to own that stuff. And here they're with Gaddafi, in the midst of it, are saying, this is ours, and we're going to use it to develop ourselves and to take care of ourselves. Now, it's in terms of the currency, which you just made a reference to, in terms of printing your own or managing your own currency and designing your own currency. This was one of the major reasons that France recolonized Cote d'Ivoire, which is what we saw happen before. I mean, the image is too beautiful of what actually happened, where the president of Cote d'Ivoire was taken out of his palace at gunpoint by French troops, remembering that France was the colonial power that was evicted from Cote d'Ivoire last time. And, Cote d'Ivoire itself, Ivory Coast, it's French for Ivory Coast. So they decided that they were no longer going to use the French franc, which is still printed in Paris for the former African colonies, and that they were going to withdraw from that, and they were going to either print their own currency or throw in with this effort to do a national, a continental currency in Africa. That was sufficient for everything, this huge, protracted, killing field, basically, that took place in that country. So the idea of doing that continent-wide with the resources to do it, with both the oil resources, the construction know-how. I mean, the underground river that was constructed in Tripoli, the engineering project, for example, one of the largest engineering projects in the history of mankind, that took place in Libya, funded by the Gaddafi government, and that was an example to the rest of the continent that, look, whatever challenges we face in terms of resource allocation or whatever, we have the talent right here and the resources right here to do it. In addition to that, rather than relying on an exploitative relationship to the communications industry for their communications, in other words, rather than having to pay ATT, ITT, Deutsche Telekom, whoever, for communications infrastructure, satellite time and such in Africa, Gaddafi built an African communications infrastructure. That by itself is billions of dollars a year that is not flowing to these corporations. And they had a whole list of projects that had already been approved and were, under development or in construction. And that, in my mind, if you look simultaneously with that, the development of AFRICOM, which, they had been talking about for years, they took real material steps, though, towards the end of the Clinton administration and through the Bush administration, and then finally they established it in October of 2008, a month before Barack Obama was elected. Kind of odd. The African Command is run from Stuttgart, Germany. I get confused whether that's NATO or Rommel or the U.S. military, but the AFRICOM is intended to be the enforcement arm of colonial exploitation of Africa. So the very moment that Gaddafi is a leading figure in a large movement to end the exploitation of Africa, the West is looking to intensify it, and so of course they were going to be banging heads, and that, I think, is a real driving force behind this entire adventure.
Well, but it's not like the United States is $15 trillion in debt, printing up worthless money backed only by a military with a near bankrupt economy.
Huh?
Well, maybe it is. Full faith and credit. We still got the ability to jack some oil and some gold.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And,
But it really looks like that. It looks like an old-fashioned 19th century imperialist jacking.
Yeah, yep, that's right. It does. The gunboat diplomacy, all that stuff. I mean, that's the deal. And I'm looking at AFRICOM's website, which is africom.mil, M-I-L, right now. And
Mil meaning military. Shocking.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. That's what it is. And they have all of a sudden all this reportage about Libya where they hadn't had very much at all except for the first week or so of the adventure. Now there's 5 stories on the front page or something, and it's amazing. And then at the very bottom full story, it says food insecurity in Eastern Africa continent's worst in 20 years.
So Libya, where the people are fed with a high standard of living,
right,
who own their own homes. And by the way, I mean, for him being a brutal dictator, they all seem to have satellites, including
you saw that too, right?
Fox Action Adventure Movies, CNN, and BBC. I mean, one of the weirdest dictators on earth, because everyone is watching Fox News, CNN, BBC, and really not so much Gaddafi's own TV station.
I know, it's funny.
We got to wrap up. Thanks a lot, Don, and keep up the great journalism. Any
Bob,
last words?
Just thanks. I hope you're well. I look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. And anyone out there that appreciates the information that we just got, honestly, the most important thing you can do right now is spread it, because we have total spectrum dominance going on throughout the rest of the media.
TalkTainmentRadio.com, the world's greatest radio. Radio the way it should be heard.
Get up, stand
Thank
up.
you for listening to Fight Back. Heard exclusively on TalkTainmentRadio.com. I'm Dr. Bob Fitrakis. Make sure you get up and stand up for your rights. Fight back.
Don't give up the fight.
You've got the power.
You are the power. Right here on Talktainment Radio.
TalkTainmentRadio.com. The way it should be heard.